autonomous, so there's probably some sort of memory component to this too, where it sends signals that are more on the chemical side of things, ultimately to stimulate your adrenal glands right above your kidneys, which is going to pump your body filled with adrenaline and cortisol. So both of these kind of work in hand to release energy into the body so that you can take care of business if you're being chased by a bear and you need to get out of there, or if you have a test coming up and you need to get out of there. So these are kind of normal responses that all of us are going to have at one point, right? So everybody has this happen, but there do seem to be some differences in the way that some of us experience this stuff. And so this is maybe where we're headed right now. We all have a certain level of what's known as trait anxiety. Any thoughts about what that is? Even though the answer's kind of being there.
It's like genetic?
Yeah, it's sort of built in a way, right? So we have a normal level of anxiety that's kind of normal for us, right? So that trait anxiety, it's going to play a part in how we experience a lot of different stuff. If you're highly anxious, you probably experience a lot of things as more anxious, because let's say you're on a scale of like 0 to 10, you're already like at a 7. Little things are going to then bump you up and up and up. You're going to be more sensitive. People lower on the scale maybe feel a little bit more resilient, and it's not such a big deal. State anxiety is what comes up in the moment when you're maybe being chased by a bear through the woods. So again, if you think about these two things kind of together, somebody who's more nervous and goes through something that's going to be pretty nerve-wracking for most anybody, or traumatic for anybody, they're probably going to be a little bit more susceptible to a PTSD-like response. So what we're talking about is high trait anxiety, and it does turn out that this is like one of the major factors involved with what seems to delineate who gets PTSD and who doesn't. People with pre-existing high anxiety, some sort of psychological issue beforehand, like anxiety, a generalized anxiety or depression or something along those lines, they're more susceptible. But I think the critical thing is the negative worldview about how they are sort of assessing what just happened to me. It seems that for real PTSD to occur, there always is a moral component. Any thoughts about what I mean by that?
Yes, like who you are as a person determines how you react sometimes?
Kind of. Any thoughts? You're very close. I would just say it in a slightly different way. When we are sort of doing a moral evaluation of a moment, we're kind of asking ourselves, did I do right or not? Right? We're kind of evaluating or judging ourselves in relation to this thing that happened to us. And if you really think about that, that gets kind of interesting, because it's almost like a grenade explodes in your life. You didn't ask for it. Here's a big problem. Now it's suddenly something for you to deal with, but it becomes a part of who you are in a way. It's threatening on a level that's about meaning. It's not just that it was scary or difficult. That might be true for everybody, but it's that it has some sort of judgment against us. I'm going to talk more about EMDR in a moment. EMDR is the treatment that's most researched for dealing with PTSD. Some of these things come from a list of treating PTSD through the EMDR approach. And these different categories kind of give an idea of how people are hard on themselves because of what they go through. So for people who have sort of the self-defectiveness component, they're basically looking at themselves like there's something wrong with me because I went through this. So you can probably, I don't know if you see it very well, think of somebody who goes into combat. If something bad happens, but they feel like they're somehow responsible for this and they did something that they weren't supposed to do, they're going to carry that component of shame or guilt on top of what already happened. So you can probably imagine seeing something gruesome or partaking in something that's pretty gruesome, but then on that moral level, feeling as if you're somehow responsible. I'm bad, right?
I think even a feeling that like, why was it him and not you, or why was it her and not you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like how did they die but you got out, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so like a survivor's guilt, absolutely. Sometimes people will even feel responsible for what happened, even though they're the ones who were victimized. So in cases of sexual assault, it's pretty typical that somebody feels like, I did something wrong here, I'm bad, even though it really wasn't about them. But people will say something like, I should have done something, or I should have known better, or you still hear it, unfortunately, where women think like, if I had only dressed differently, maybe he wouldn't have come after me. It's not what you wore that's the issue. right? So anyway, these two domains. Next to safety and vulnerability, where you start to feel as if no matter where you go, you're just not okay. The world is a scary place, and I can't handle myself in it, which actually leads to that second domain where I'm not in control or I'm powerless. Again, this gets overgeneralized into a person's larger life, and they end up feeling as if something's wrong all the time, which probably contributes to that kind of shrinking away from the real world again, and why you see so many people with PTSD isolating themselves. There is an interesting study, and I talk about this in the dreams class that I teach. I think around 2012, unfortunately I don't have the real information for this, but they did a study of heart attack patients and who developed PTSD and who didn't. And what was kind of strange about the study is that for people who never talked about their feelings, the stoic types who kind of just like grin and bear it, only 7% of them got PTSD. But when you look at people who were really expressive about what was going on, the ones who talked about it all the time, almost 20% got PTSD. So what does that mean? Does that mean talking about it's bad? I mean, we're all psychology types. Like, we think that, you know, we need to talk about these things. They'll get better that way. What do you think is going on?
I think it encourages other people to also open up about it. So the expressives might interact and just encourage each other.
Yeah, but that would be a good thing, it sounds like. How come more people get PTSD?
I think that by talking about it, you're constantly reliving it, whereas if you're not talking about it, you're trying to suppress it.
Okay.
And I mean, obviously, if you keep talking about it, it's gonna keep stressing you out. You're gonna keep reliving that moment.
Yeah, I appreciate what you just said, so I'm gonna build on it. It's not as if the stoic types are necessarily doing the right thing either. Maybe that's not the best way to do it, because like you said, maybe they're suppressing something. On some level, they're still suffering. They might not meet criteria for PTSD, but remember how many criteria you actually have to meet to get that. Just because they're suppressing some of these things doesn't mean that they aren't having a really bad time of all this, right? We also don't know how the expressive types are actually talking about this. They could just be reliving it, going over and over and over the same thing again and again. And so maybe it's how we talk about it that's at issue, right? To really get PTSD to go away means that you have to kind of talk about it, but also come to a new understanding of what happened. If you've been taking on too much responsibility for whatever occurred, somehow you have to learn to accept what this is and be able to move on. So I like studies like this because if you just look at the statistics, it suggests one thing, but you kind of have to look beyond it a little bit and to see what the real case is. It is better to talk, but in the right way. I think that's probably where we're headed in a moment here. Just to give some basic statistics though, only about 5% of the population ever really gets a PTSD diagnosis. It is more common in women than men. Any thoughts about why?
Because they're more expressive?
Yeah.
Perhaps. I think that's probably one of those things. I think there are a couple other things going on. Women are probably also more victimized in their regular lives than guys are. Guys who get victimized are probably more in combat situations or in a job that puts them in violence, in harm's way. So that might be part of it too. I think there's a reporting issue where guys often wouldn't report that something goes on with them. The person who taught me how to do EMDR used to work in the military, and their biggest problem was actually getting men and women to actually admit that there was a problem, because unfortunately then they would be dealt with as if they were a problem, and they would lose their status or their position somehow. So there was this incentive almost to not say something, right? So I bet actually men and women alike can experience PTSD. But I also wonder if women have a way of taking on more responsibility sometimes and assuming that they're at fault when they're not. Just a hunch. Anyway, further research there. But obviously something bad needs to happen that's a pretty marked event for PTSD to occur. There's a quote about this actually. So people generally don't suffer high rates of PTSD after natural disasters. Instead, people suffer from PTSD after moral atrocities. Soldiers who've endured the depraved world of combat experience their own symptoms. Trauma is an explosive cataclysm of the soul. So again, it's something that's really a marked change from